Steph, thank you very much. As we say goodbye to 2022 and get ready to welcome in 2023, we're looking back at some of the top stories that made headlines with City News journalist Mark McAllister. Mark does a great job. Let's give Mark a round of applause here.
Thanks for getting up early.
I'm overdressed to the. I've got the blue. That could.
We didn't send you the email today, did we?
Mark, we should have told you.
No, you're dressed properly. Good to see you. Great to see you. In January of this year, I think I've said this to you. I said to myself, boy, I hope COVID doesn't dominate the news cycle again.
That's right.
And to a certain extent, it did not. But boy, were there some curveballs in other directions that none of us were expecting.
COVID related, right? So when we talk about the big stories of the year,
true, in a way,
this was directly related to it. As we were finishing up, well, we're still in it, but as we were hearing the calls about the COVID measures and such, guess what? Everybody wants to go to Ottawa.
Well, let's talk about that. To me, the biggest story in the country this year. Agree or disagree?
I would certainly say so. Yeah. Now, concentrated on the capital of our country, yes, and it started to obviously make its way around. But there was people feeling the same thing throughout the country.
For sure.
And it made international news. It really did.
Of course. Yeah. Well, when you shut down the capital of the country and you have the ability to do that, then it's certainly going to make international news, especially when we were hearing things like this coming out of the U.S. People didn't like the COVID measures. They were speaking out. Then it became something related to anti-government and anti-vaccine. It became something much, much bigger than it was originally intended. And this is what happens as a result. And a lot of things started to come to the surface beyond just the sentiment from the people that were there, but how it was handled.
It felt like all the things came to the surface, didn't it? Like it felt like anyone who had a gripe with Canadian society in any way, that's why it was a little out of control most of the time and officials couldn't get a handle on who was running things. Anyone who had a gripe came to Ottawa, it felt like.
It was all about anti-Trudeau in the end, was it not? And that's why people were bringing out the Canadian flags and talking about that, is they didn't like the way the government handled everything and they wanted to make themselves heard.
For sure.
And there was a hearing just recently. So we go from Prime Minister Trudeau to more in politics, which makes your list, which of course is elections, Ella Ford and Mayor Tory.
Yeah, obviously, starting with the provincial election in June, everybody thought, okay, but Doug Ford's going to get elected again. What happens as a result of that is what we're dealing with now. Yes, he certainly got a mandate, talked about a number of things, and it was all based on what happened during COVID. Did the governments handle themselves well? I think most people would have said, yes, they did what they needed to do. However, it's what's happened since.
It has. And Mark, you know this as well as anyone. Ontario likes to give a second mandate for a premier. Like, it's odd for a one and done for a premier of this province. Well, your headline with this election win from Doug Ford in the summer of this year, was it that he increased his majority or voter turnout? What was the bigger headline to you?
Voter turnout down, as far as I'm concerned, and I think most people thought that way too. It was basically whether it was fatigue based on the fact that we'd had other elections recently, or the fact that COVID had set in, or we simply just didn't want to come out. There's a number of different reasons, but I think the voter turnout, and it was reflected in the municipal elections as well.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
And of course, Mayor Tory, we just saw him a week ago having his superpowers, his mayor powers extended, which you also addressed that morning.
Maybe just briefly.
That's a trickle down from what's happening on a provincial level, right? So Doug Ford and the provincial government certainly wanted to put their stamp on things at this point. Education workers, et cetera, et cetera.
Housing was a big one.
Housing is the big one, and being able to make sure that they get the housing built and the highways, all that stuff. But in order to do so, what they said is, we're going to give the municipalities, or at least Toronto and Ottawa, a little more power to push our priorities through. And as a result, Mayor John Tory gets elected. However, he's facing the fire as a result of that as well.
Let's talk about the passing of Queen Elizabeth. The whole world was watching, which was multi-day long events, marathon reporting. People stayed in line for 12 to 15 hours, including David Beckham. And it was unbelievable, really, as one of the longest serving monarchs ever.
When you see that many people make their way to London, grieving collectively across the world, including here in Canada, it said a lot about the Queen herself and what she represented in terms of the person. She was a motherly figure, a grandmotherly figure to many people, obviously had been in her position as Queen for generations. So it said a lot about her. But what stood out for me in the conversation here in Canada was the role the monarchy has in our country and other countries around the world.
Yeah.
Lots of discussion in and around that. Obviously, there's lots of mourning taking place, but the reflection in and around where do we sit within the Commonwealth, and do we need the monarchy anymore? There was a lot of sentiments. There's one thing about the Queen, but do we want King Charles as our king here in Canada? And there was lots of discussion around that as well.
For sure.
Yeah, how many people will tune into the coronation in May?
And May 6th of next year, and it
Yeah.
continues. So finally, stability in Europe seemed to be a theme here, because when the sovereign passed, some foundations are shaken in Europe, because she was a stabilizing figure.
Yep.
The invasion of Ukraine, the terrorist act against Ukraine. Your thoughts on how it was covered, and where do you think it goes in 2023?
Who knows where it goes at this point? Obviously, when we talk about the top stories, this is by far the top story internationally at this point. It's whether or not other countries are stepping up and helping at this point has been the question from the start, and will continue to be the question. And we watch what's happening there to the people of the Ukraine, the reflection here in the Ukrainian community here in Toronto. But what happens now is how our countries will step up and certainly help. And when we saw Zelensky at Congress and making that plea once again, obviously we know it's going to continue, and we need to be able to help.
Absolutely. This again will be one of the biggest stories of our lifetime. Mark McAllister, great stuff.
Thanks, Mark.
Great to
City
see you
News
guys.
will be,
Good to see you.
they'll be
Merry
on it
Christmas.
for the entire year.